Welcome once again to Beyond Midnight. Tonight, we delve not into the shadows of the supernatural, but into the chillingly stark reality of history, a reality often obscured by the romanticized fog of legend and cinematic spectacle. We speak of the samurai, those iconic warriors of feudal Japan, whose image, for many, conjures visions of stoic honor, swift blades, and poetic demise under cherry blossoms. A powerful image, certainly, and for the most part, a profoundly misleading one. For the truth, unvarnished and unyielding, is that the life of a samurai was not merely dangerous. It was an existence perpetually teetering on the precipice of gruesome, often ignoble, death. It was a life far deadlier than you have likely ever considered. Forget the graceful duels of cinema. Dismiss the notion of clean, decisive battles. The reality was a brutal, relentless grind of violence, disease, starvation, and betrayal, where the average lifespan was truncated, and the manner of one's end was rarely dignified. Let us begin at the beginning, not with a flourish of steel, but with the cradle. A samurai was not born into a life of leisure, awaiting the call to arms. He was born into a destiny forged in iron and blood, a destiny that began shaping him from infancy. The very air he breathed was thick with the scent of war, whether present or imminent. From the moment a boy could walk, his training commenced. It wasn't merely about wielding a sword or a spear. It was about forging a human weapon, utterly devoid of fear, utterly committed to a code that demanded unwavering loyalty and an absolute willingness to sacrifice everything. Children were subjected to drills that would be considered abusive by modern standards. They were taught to sleep outdoors in harsh weather, to endure hunger and thirst, to walk barefoot over rough terrain for miles. Their martial training began with wooden swords, then gradually progressed to blunted steel, where mistakes often meant broken bones or dislocated joints. They were taught to fall, to roll, to take a blow and immediately rise. They were drilled relentlessly in the forms of kenjutsu, sujutsu, kyujutsu, the arts of the sword, spear, and bow. But beyond the physical, there was the psychological hardening. They were exposed to death early. Sometimes they were taken to execution grounds to witness beheadings, not as a punishment, but as a lesson in the fragility of life and the finality of their chosen path. They were told stories of heroic self-sacrifice, of samurai who embraced death for their lord without hesitation. This was not merely education, it was indoctrination, designed to strip away the natural human aversion to violence and replace it with an almost spiritual acceptance of bloodshed. By the time a samurai reached his late teens, he was a finely tuned instrument of war, but also a walking target. The Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, which stretched for over a century and a half from the mid-15th to the early 17th century, was an era of unprecedented chaos and brutality. It was not a period of occasional skirmishes. It was a continuous, grinding conflict that consumed entire generations. Daimyo regional lords rose and fell with terrifying speed, their fortunes turning on a single battle, a single act of treachery, or a single outbreak of plague. For the samurai serving these lords, life was a constant state of readiness, a perpetual vigil against the unknown. Imagine, if you will, the daily existence. You are a low-ranking samurai, perhaps a foot soldier or ashigaru, though even a high-ranking samurai faced similar perils. Your home, if you had one, was likely a modest dwelling in a castle town, perpetually vulnerable to attack. News traveled slowly, often by rumor, and every whisper of a rival lord's movements sent a ripple of anxiety through the community. You slept with your weapons close, your armor within reach. There was no true peace, only lulls in the storm. When the call to arms came, it was immediate and absolute. You would gather your meager possessions, don your armor, a complex assembly of lacquered plates, silk cords, and metal scales, surprisingly flexible but heavy and hot, and join your lord's contingent. Marches were grueling. Armies did not travel on paved roads with supply lines. They traversed rugged mountains, forded icy rivers, slogged through muddy rice paddies. A typical march could cover dozens of miles a day, carrying your own equipment, often with minimal rations. Dysentery, cholera, and other diseases spread like wildfire through these crowded, unsanitary columns. A simple cut or blister could fester into a life-threatening infection. Many samurai, particularly the Ashigaru who often lacked proper footwear, died not from a blade, but from exhaustion, exposure, or a raging fever contracted on the march before they even saw an enemy. And then the battle itself. Forget the cinematic one-on-one duels that dominate popular perception. These were rare, almost ceremonial, occurrences, often between high-ranking samurai seeking to display their prowess before the main engagement. The vast majority of combat was a chaotic, horrifying melee of hundreds, often thousands of men. Imagine the scene, the ground trembling under the thundering charge of cavalry, the air thick with the twang of bowstrings and the whistle of arrows, the guttural roars of men, the clang of steel on steel, the sickening thud of a spear finding its mark. The primary weapon of the samurai was not always the katana, the curved sword so revered today. While iconic, the katana was often a secondary weapon, used when the primary weapon was lost or broken, or in close-quarters combat. The true workhorses of the battlefield were the yari, the spear, and the naginata, a polearm with a curved blade. These weapons offered reach, allowing a warrior to keep an opponent at bay, to pierce armor, and to create devastating formations. A well-drilled unit of spearmen could impale an enemy charge with terrifying efficiency. Arrows, too, were deadly, capable of piercing armor at range, felling warriors before they even closed the distance. And then with the arrival of the Portuguese in the mid-16th century came the Tangashima, the matchlock arquebus. These early firearms, though slow to reload and temperamental in damp weather, were devastatingly effective. A musket ball could rip through armor and flesh with brutal force, shattering bones and causing grievous, often untreatable, wounds. A battlefield was not a place of clean cuts, it was a charnel house. Swords, spears, and polearms inflicted terrible injuries, severed limbs, gaping wounds that exposed bone and viscera, crushed skulls. An arrow could lodge deep in the chest or throat, leaving the victim to choke on their own blood. A musket ball could tear through a body, leaving a ragged, festering hole. There was no sophisticated medical care. Wounds were often crudely bandaged, if at all, with dirty rags. Infection was rampant. Even a minor wound could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to a slow, agonizing death by sepsis. Many samurai, rather than face such a fate, would attempt seppuku, ritual suicide, if they were mortally wounded and knew they could not escape. But even that, as we shall discuss, was rarely the dignified act portrayed in fiction. The fighting itself was rarely a static line. It was fluid, brutal, and often devolving into individual duels amidst the chaos. Warriors would grapple, fall, and struggle in the mud, often being trampled by their own comrades or the enemy. The noise was deafening, the screams of the wounded, the shouts of commanders, the rhythmic pounding of war drums. The smell was overpowering, sweat, blood, excrement, and the metallic tang of fear. It was a sensory overload designed to break the will, to reduce men to primal instinct. And it was not just direct combat that killed. Ambushes were a favored tactic. Imagine marching through a narrow mountain pass, the trees thick and silent, only for a volley of arrows to rain down from above, followed by a sudden charge from hidden enemy forces. There was no warning, no chance to prepare. Death came swiftly and without ceremony. Night attacks, too, were common, often launched against unsuspecting camps. In the darkness, friend and foe could be indistinguishable, leading to frantic, confused fighting where casualties were often self-inflicted. Beyond the immediate carnage of battle, there was the prolonged agony of siege warfare. Castles, the strongholds of the daimyo, were formidable structures designed to withstand assault, but a siege was not a quick affair. It could drag on for weeks, months, even years. The besieging army would attempt to starve out the defenders, cutting off supply lines, poisoning wells, and launching sporadic attacks to wear down morale. For the samurai inside the castle, life became a slow descent into hell. Rations dwindled. Water became scarce. Disease, again, was a constant companion, spreading rapidly through the cramped, unsanitary confines of the besieged fortress. Dysentery, typhus, and smallpox decimated garrisons more effectively than any direct assault. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine the constant gnawing hunger, the thirst, the stench of unburied dead, the cries of the sick and dying. Morale would plummet. Desertion became a tempting, if deadly, option. And then there was the ever-present threat of betrayal. A samurai, driven by desperation or ambition, might open a gate, poison a lord, or sell information to the enemy. Loyalty, while idealized, was often a fragile commodity in a world where survival was paramount and fortunes shifted with the wind. Many a siege ended not with a glorious last stand, but with a whimper, as a gate was opened by a traitor, or the last defenders, emaciated and weakened by disease, were overwhelmed. For the samurai on the attacking side of a siege, the dangers were different but no less severe. They faced the same risks of disease and starvation, often encamped in makeshift shelters exposed to the elements. They endured constant harassment from the besieged, who would launch arrows, stones, and even boiling water from the castle walls. Assaults on the castle walls were suicidal endeavors, often involving climbing ladders under a hail of projectiles, only to be met by desperate defenders wielding spears and swords from above. The casualties in a prolonged siege, for both attacker and defender, were often astronomical, far exceeding those of open-field battles. And what of the honor, so intrinsically linked with the samurai? It was a double-edged sword, often leading to actions that were self-destructive or compelled a warrior towards an agonizing end. The concept of bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a static, universally applied code. It evolved over centuries and was interpreted differently by various clans and individuals. But at its core, it emphasized loyalty, courage, and a disregard for one's own life in service to the Lord. This disregard for life, while heroic in concept, often meant that retreat was not an option, even when facing overwhelming odds. It meant fighting to the last man, even when survival might have served the Lord better in the long run. Seppuku or harakiri, ritual suicide by disembowelment, is perhaps the most iconic and misunderstood aspect of samurai honor. It was not a graceful, poetic act of self-sacrifice performed in a serene garden. It was a brutal, agonizing form of death, designed to demonstrate courage and purity of spirit in the face of disgrace or defeat. The act itself involved plunging a short sword, a tanto, into the abdomen and drawing it across, a process that was excruciatingly painful and often prolonged. To ensure a swift end and prevent a warrior from flinching or showing weakness, a trusted friend or retainer, the kaishikunin, stood by, ready to deliver a swift decapitating blow with a katana the moment the sword was plunged into the belly. Even then, the kaishikunin had to be precise. A botched decapitation could be as agonizing as the self-inflicted wound. Seppuku was often not a choice, but a command. A defeated general, a samurai whose lord had fallen, or one who had committed a grave error might be ordered to commit seppuku to restore honor to his family or clan. Refusal meant public execution, disgrace for one's descendants, and the confiscation of all family lands and titles. So many samurai faced this horrifying end not out of a serene desire for honor, but out of a desperate attempt to preserve their family's legacy in a world that valued honor above all else. It was a forced choice between one terrible death and an even more terrible disgrace. The life of a samurai was also fraught with the perils of political intrigue and betrayal. The Sengoku Jidai was a time of shifting alliances, where today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. Daimyo regularly betrayed one another, and samurai frequently switched allegiances if it meant survival or advancement. The most famous example, perhaps, is Akichi Mitsuhide, who betrayed Oda Nobunaga, his lord, at Hanojai Temple, leading to Nobunaga's death. Such acts, while condemned as disloyal, were not uncommon. For the individual samurai, this meant a constant state of suspicion, an inability to fully trust even those closest to them. A sudden summons from your lord could mean a promotion, or it could mean an accusation of disloyalty and a forced seppuku. The very ground beneath their feet was unstable. Even in times of relative peace, the threat of death lingered. A samurai was expected to maintain his martial prowess, to be ready for battle at a moment's notice. Duels, though less common than portrayed, did occur, often over matters of honor or perceived insult. The slightest transgression could lead to a challenge and a duel to the death. Furthermore, the very structure of samurai society, with its rigid hierarchy and emphasis on social order, could be deadly. A samurai who failed to perform his duties, who showed cowardice in battle, or who committed an offense against a superior, faced severe punishment, often death. There was little room for error, little forgiveness for weakness. Consider the aftermath of a major battle. The victorious army would often spend days or weeks consolidating their gains, hunting down stragglers, and dealing with the wounded. For the defeated, the pursuit was relentless. Those who fled were often cut down by cavalry, hunted through the countryside, or captured and executed. Heads were taken as trophies, counted and presented to the victorious lord as proof of valor and success. The sight of severed heads, often displayed on pikes or arranged for inspection, was a common one. This dehumanization of the enemy further fueled the brutality of the conflict. The common people, the farmers and artisans, were not immune to this relentless cycle of violence. While not samurai, they were often caught in the crossfire. Villages were plundered, crops destroyed, and populations massacred by marauding armies, regardless of allegiance. Peasants were conscripted as ashigaru, often armed with little more than a spear and a prayer, thrown into the meat grinder of battle with little training and even less hope of survival. Their deaths, unlike those of samurai, were rarely recorded, their lives considered expendable. Famine, exacerbated by armies burning fields and disrupting trade routes, was a constant threat, claiming far more lives than any battle. The psychological burden on a samurai was immense. Constant exposure to violence, death, and the ever-present threat of one's own demise, coupled with the rigid demands of Bushido, would have led to widespread trauma. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder would have been rampant. Sleep would have been disturbed by nightmares. The senses would have been hyper-alert, always scanning for danger. The emotional detachment necessary to perform acts of extreme violence would have bled into daily life, making normal human connection difficult. Many samurai would have lived out their days as haunted, broken men, even if they survived the battlefield. Let us briefly consider some specific historical instances that underscore this deadliness. The Battle of Okezama in 1560, where Oda Nobunaga, with a vastly inferior force, launched a surprise attack in a thunderstorm and defeated Imagawa Yoshimoto, was a testament to the effectiveness of ambush tactics. Yoshimoto and many of his high-ranking samurai were cut down in the confusion, their deaths swift and unexpected. It wasn't a grand, drawn-out battle. It was a sudden, brutal massacre. Or consider the siege of Osaka in 1614-1615, the final major conflict that cemented Tokugawa Ieyasu's rule and ended the Sengoku Jidai. This was not just one siege, but two, separated by a brief truce. Thousands upon thousands perished, not just from combat, but from disease, starvation, and the sheer exhaustion of prolonged conflict. The final assault on Osaka Castle was a desperate, bloody affair, with defenders fighting to the last, knowing that defeat meant annihilation. The castle fell, and with it, the last vestiges of resistance to the Tokugawa shogunate, but the cost in lives was astronomical. Even the most powerful figures were not immune. Oda Nobunaga, the unifier of Japan, met his end not on a glorious battlefield, but through the betrayal of his most trusted general, Aikshai Mitsuhide, at Hanojai Temple. Trapped and outnumbered, Nobunaga chose to commit seppuku rather than be captured, his life ending in a burning temple, far from the battlefield glory he had so often sought. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's successor, died of natural causes, but his legacy was immediately plunged into conflict by his former allies, leading to the Battle of Sekigahara, a clash that decided the fate of Japan and claimed tens of thousands of lives. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the ultimate victor, lived to a ripe old age, but his life was a continuous saga of warfare, political maneuvering, and the constant threat of assassination or betrayal. He outlived many of his sons and allies, a testament to his ruthlessness and strategic genius, but also a stark reminder of the deadly environment he navigated. The samurai, therefore, were not just warriors. They were survivors in a world designed to kill them. They were products of a system that demanded absolute obedience and absolute sacrifice. Their lives were short, brutal, and often ended in ways that were anything but honorable by modern standards. The romanticized image of the lone, noble warrior, meditating under cherry blossoms before a clean duel, is a comforting fantasy. The reality was the stench of blood and fear, the agony of wounds, the gnawing pain of hunger, the constant vigilance against betrayal, and the ever-present shadow of a swift, ignoble death on a muddy battlefield or within a besieged castle. The warrior's life in feudal Japan was a relentless gauntlet of perils, where survival was a daily struggle against not just the enemy blade, but against disease, famine, exposure, and the treacherous currents of human ambition. The samurai code, while providing a framework for existence, also often dictated a path towards a premature and often agonizing end. They were men forged in the crucible of constant warfare, and few emerged whole, fewer still alive. And this truly is just the beginning of understanding the true horrors and challenges that define the samurai existence. We've merely scratched the surface of the meticulous, often horrific, details that made their lives a constant dance with death. The intricacies of their armor, the psychological warfare, the post-war realities, the impact on their families, there is so much more to uncover. We left off, if you recall, on the precipice of a deeper understanding, having merely brushed against the surface of the grim realities that define the samurai existence. The romanticized veneer of honor and stoicism, as we established, conceals a truth far more visceral, a life perpetually steeped in the scent of blood and the shadow of an agonizing demise. Let us now descend further into this abyss, examining the very tools and environments that ensured the samurai's life was indeed far deadlier than you could possibly imagine. Consider for a moment the samurai's armor, the omakron-yor or gyusoku. Popular imagination often conjures images of gleaming, impenetrable suits of steel. The reality was a complex, multi-layered construction of lacquered iron or leather scales, meticulously laced together with silk cords. While it offered significant protection against slashing blows and arrow strikes, it was far from invulnerable. It was also incredibly heavy, weighing upwards of 25-30 kilograms, 55-66 pounds for a full suit. Imagine marching for miles, climbing hills, fighting for hours, all while encased in this cumbersome shell, often under the unforgiving Japanese sun or in torrential rain. Heat stroke was a significant, often fatal, risk. Exhaustion could claim a warrior before an enemy blade ever did. Vision was restricted by the helmet kabuto and its face mask, menpo, and hearing was muffled. A warrior could easily miss an approaching foe, stumble on uneven ground, or become disoriented in the chaos. Furthermore, armor had weak points. The armpits, the groin, the back of the neck, the gaps between plates, these were all vulnerabilities that a skilled opponent would relentlessly target. A well-placed spear thrust could penetrate the lacquered scales, or an arrow could find its way through a gap. Once pierced, the wound, as previously noted, was almost certainly fatal due to infection. The very act of donning and doffing this armor was a laborious process, requiring assistance, further illustrating how ill-suited it was for anything but prepared, static combat. In a sudden ambush or a retreat, it became a burden, often discarded by fleeing warriors desperate to lighten their load and escape. Many samurai drowned attempting to cross rivers, dragged down by the weight of their armor. And the weapons, the katana, that symbol of samurai prowess, was indeed a masterwork of metallurgy, renowned for its sharpness and durability. But it was not a crowbar. Its edge, while keen, was relatively delicate and could chip or even break if struck against bone or another blade incorrectly. Maintaining its razor sharpness required constant care and skill. In the swirling melee of a battlefield, a katana was often used for quick, decisive strikes, but it was not the primary weapon for breaking formations or engaging multiple opponents at range. That honor belonged, overwhelmingly, to the yari, the spear. The yari was the true workhorse of the samurai army, ranging from short, dagger-like spears to immense pike-like weapons over 5 meters, 16 feet, long. They were devastatingly effective. A wall of disciplined spearmen could impale cavalry charges, skewer individual opponents, and keep enemies at bay. The reach offered by a spear allowed a warrior to strike an opponent before they could close to sword distance, a critical advantage in an age of close-quarters combat. A spear thrust could pierce armor, create deep, jagged wounds, and inflict massive internal bleeding. Many samurai died impaled, their bodies lifted off the ground by the force of the blow, a far cry from the clean, swift death often associated with the sword. Then came the tangashima, the matchlock arquebus, introduced in the mid-16th century. This weapon, though initially viewed with suspicion by traditionalists, revolutionized warfare and dramatically increased the lethality of the battlefield. Imagine the scene: the acrid smell of gunpowder, the deafening roar of hundreds of arquebuses firing simultaneously, the thick clouds of smoke obscuring vision. The sheer psychological terror of facing an unseen enemy whose projectiles could rip through armor and flesh with brutal, shattering force was immense. A musket ball did not merely cut, it pulverized. It shattered bone, tore through organs, and caused exit wounds far larger than the entry. These wounds were almost impossible to treat, leading to agonizing deaths from internal bleeding, shock, or overwhelming infection. While slow to reload and susceptible to damp weather, the matchlock's power was undeniable. Units of disciplined arquebusiers, firing in volleys, could decimate enemy ranks, turning a charge into a slaughter. The very nature of combat shifted, favoring massed firepower over individual skill, further diminishing the romantic ideal of the warrior. Beyond the physical tools of death, there was the psychological warfare, a constant, insidious pressure that wore down even the most hardened samurai. Rumors were deliberately spread to sow discord and fear. The display of severed heads, as mentioned, was not merely a tally, it was a potent psychological weapon. After a battle, victorious armies would often gather the heads of their enemies, clean them, tag them, and present them to their lord. Imagine the sight: hundreds, sometimes thousands, of disembodied heads lined up for inspection, their faces frozen in expressions of agony or terror. This was not just a macabre spectacle, it was a chilling message to any potential resistors or future enemies. It was a stark reminder of the fate that awaited those who defied the victor. Atrocities against civilian populations were also a form of psychological warfare. The burning of villages, the slaughter of non-combatants, the destruction of crops, these acts were designed to break the will of the enemy, to deny them resources, and to instill a pervasive terror that would make resistance seem futile. While samurai code ostensibly forbade wanton cruelty, the realities of total war often overrode such niceties. The line between warrior and brigand blurred, particularly for those on the losing side, or those whose lords could no longer pay them. The immediate aftermath of a battle was often as deadly as the combat itself. The wounded, if they survived the initial engagement, were often left to die on the field, succumbing to blood loss, exposure, or further injury from scavengers or opportunistic enemies. Those too badly wounded to move were often dispatched by victorious samurai, a mercy killing perhaps, or simply to ensure they would not rise again. Prisoners of war were rare. Most captured samurai faced immediate execution, often by beheading, to prevent them from returning to fight again. The concept of taking prisoners for ransom or exchange was not as prevalent as in some Western feudal systems. It was a war of annihilation, where the objective was to utterly destroy the enemy's fighting capability, not merely to defeat them. The post-battle landscape was a gruesome tableau. Bodies lay twisted and broken, often stripped of their armor and weapons by opportunistic scavengers. The ground would be churned into a bloody mire. The stench of death would hang heavy in the air for days. And then came the diseases. Battlefields, littered with corpses and human waste, became breeding grounds for epidemics. Dysentery, typhus, cholera. These scourges would sweep through both victorious and defeated armies, claiming more lives in the weeks and months after a battle than the conflict itself. The lack of sanitation, clean water, and medical knowledge ensured that even the strongest warriors could be brought low by an invisible foe. The impact of this relentless violence extended far beyond the battlefield, deeply scarring the families of the samurai. For the women, wives, and mothers, life was a constant state of anxiety. Their husbands, sons, and brothers were perpetually at risk, often absent for months or years on campaign. News of battles would travel slowly, and the arrival of a messenger could bring tidings of victory or the devastating news of a loved one's death. Many samurai women were expected to be strong, to manage the household and estate in their husband's absence, and even to defend the home if it came under attack. Some were trained in self-defense, wielding a naginata or a dagger, prepared to fight to the death or commit suicide rather than face capture and dishonor. The concept of jigai, ritual suicide for women, often by cutting the throat, was a grim parallel to seppuku, a final act of preserving family honor in a world that offered them little agency beyond their roles within the household. Children, particularly sons, were raised with the knowledge that their destiny was to follow in their father's footsteps, to enter this same deadly profession. Their childhoods were not filled with play, but with rigorous training and the omnipresent shadow of their future. Daughters, too, lived with the constant threat of their family's destruction, their lives often determined by strategic marriages that could be dissolved or overturned by the whims of war. Economically, the samurai's life was also precarious. While high-ranking samurai might command vast estates and significant income, lower-ranking samurai, particularly goknin, housemen, or ashigaru, often lived on meager stipends or small landholdings that were constantly vulnerable to confiscation or destruction by warring factions. Maintaining their armor, weapons, and horses was expensive. Many samurai families lived on the brink of poverty, constantly in debt, their economic security as fragile as their lives. A samurai who lost his lord, either through defeat or death, could become a ronin, a masterless samurai. While some ronin found new employment, many became wanderers, resorting to banditry or dueling for survival, often meeting violent and ignominious ends. The romantic image of the wandering ronin seeking enlightenment often ignores the grim reality of starvation, desperation, and violence that defined their existence. Even during the relative peace of the Edo period, 1603–1868, after the Sengoku Jidai finally ended, the shadow of death never truly lifted for the samurai. While large-scale battles ceased, the strict social hierarchy and the emphasis on honor meant that duels still occurred, often over trivial slights. Executions for crimes or insubordination were common, and the Bushido Code, now codified and formalized, still demanded a willingness to die for one's lord, even if that meant a forced seppuku for a minor infraction or a perceived failure. The samurai, stripped of their battlefield purpose, became bureaucrats and administrators, but the underlying threat of violence and death remained an intrinsic part of their identity. Their very existence was defined by their readiness to die, a readiness that, even in peace, could be called upon at any moment. The constant proximity to death permeated every aspect of samurai culture, influencing their art, their poetry, and their philosophy. The transient beauty of the cherry blossom, blooming gloriously for a brief period before scattering to the wind, became a powerful metaphor for the samurai's life, brilliant, fleeting, and destined for a sudden, beautiful, yet often brutal end. This melancholic acceptance of mortality was not a sign of weakness, but a profound understanding of their perilous existence. It was a philosophy born of necessity, a way to cope with a life where death was not an abstract concept, but a daily companion. The idealized samurai, a figure of serene calm and unwavering resolve, was indeed real in moments, a testament to incredible discipline and mental fortitude. But this calm was forged in a crucible of unimaginable violence, fear, and suffering. It was a veneer over a life that was short, brutal, and often ended in a manner that defied any notion of grace or dignity. The true samurai was not merely a warrior, he was a survivor, navigating a landscape saturated with danger, where every decision, every step could lead to a swift and agonizing demise. The legend, captivating as it is, pales in comparison to the chilling, visceral truth. Consider the pervasive threat of espionage and assassination. In the fractured landscape of feudal Japan, where alliances shifted like desert sands and trust was a rare commodity, intelligence gathering was paramount. Spies, often disguised as merchants, monks, or even ordinary peasants, infiltrated rival domains, gleaning information on troop movements, supply lines, and internal dissent. This was not a gentleman's game. Discovery meant torture and a gruesome death. But the information they brought back could be the difference between victory and annihilation for their lord. And beyond information, there was the dagger in the dark. Assassination was a common and effective tool of warfare, often targeting rival daimyo, generals, or even key advisors whose removal could destabilize an enemy clan. Imagine being a samurai, even a high-ranking one. You lived not only with the fear of an enemy army, but with the chilling knowledge that a trusted retainer, a seemingly loyal guard, or even a servant could be a paid assassin. Food could be poisoned, a path could be ambushed, a friendly visit could end with a sudden, fatal blow. The most secure castles were not immune. There are countless historical accounts of assassins infiltrating strongholds, sometimes even reaching the lord's chambers. This constant, creeping paranoia added another layer of deadliness to an already perilous life. Sleep would have been light, suspicion a constant companion. Every new face, every unexpected sound, could signal the end. The environment itself was often as deadly as any enemy blade. Japan's rugged terrain, with its steep mountains, dense forests, and countless rivers, posed immense challenges to armies on the march. Armies frequently had to traverse treacherous mountain passes, where a single misstep could send a warrior plummeting to his death. Flash floods could sweep away entire contingents attempting to ford a swollen river. Landslides, particularly during the rainy season, could bury columns of men and horses. The cold of winter campaigns, with its biting winds and heavy snows, brought the threat of frostbite and hypothermia, claiming lives as effectively as any weapon. Summer, with its oppressive humidity, led to heat stroke and the rapid spoilage of food and water, accelerating the spread of disease. Many a campaign was decided not by direct combat, but by the elements, which decimated armies before they ever reached the battlefield. And then there were the natural disasters. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis, though less frequent, were devastating when they occurred. While not directly linked to warfare, they could cripple a domain, destroy infrastructure, and lead to widespread famine, further exacerbating the already dire conditions and often sparking new conflicts as desperate lords sought to seize resources from weakened neighbors. A samurai's life was therefore a constant struggle against both human and natural forces determined to end it. Beyond the grand battles, much of the warfare in the Sengoku Jidai was a dirty war of raids, skirmishes, and terror. Small bands of samurai, often ronin or those specifically tasked with harassment, would descend upon enemy villages, burning homes, seizing crops, and killing civilians. This was not merely wanton destruction. It was a deliberate strategy to deny resources to the enemy, to break the morale of their populace, and to draw out their forces. For the samurai involved in these raids, the danger was constant: a sudden counterattack, an ambush by local militias, or capture by the enemy. For the samurai defending their domains, it meant endless patrols, constant vigilance, and the grim task of confronting these brutal incursions. The practice of tsujijiri, or crossroads killing, while perhaps more prevalent in later periods of peace, speaks volumes about the casual brutality that permeated samurai society. This was the act of testing a new sword or one's skill by attacking an unsuspecting passerby, often a commoner at a crossroads. While officially condemned, it was rarely punished severely and highlights a chilling disregard for human life that was, in part, a byproduct of the constant exposure to violence and death. It underscores the idea that a samurai was always ready to kill, and that death could come from the most unexpected of sources, even from a fellow warrior seeking to hone his blade. The fate of the defeated, particularly those of high rank, was often a prolonged agony. If a daimyo or a significant general was captured, they faced a choice between forced seppuku to preserve their family's honor or public execution, often a slow and humiliating process. Their entire clan could be annihilated, their lands confiscated, their family name erased from history. For the samurai serving such a defeated lord, the options were equally grim. They could choose to die fighting alongside their lord, commit seppuku themselves, or attempt to flee and become a ronin, facing a life of poverty, wandering, and constant danger. Many ronin were hunted down and killed, or died from starvation and disease. Those who survived often became mercenaries, their lives still dictated by the blade, but now without the protective mantle of a lord or clan. The psychological toll of this existence was profound and multifaceted. We touched upon what we now call PTSD, but it was more than just the trauma of battle. It was the trauma of constant uncertainty, of living in a world where betrayal was commonplace, where a loved one could be snatched away by war or disease at any moment, and where your own life was never truly your own. The very concept of self was often subsumed by the demands of the clan and the lord. This constant suppression of individual emotion, this relentless focus on duty and honor, while outwardly creating stoic warriors, would have led to deep internal turmoil. How did they cope? Through a rigid adherence to ritual, through the pursuit of martial perfection, through a fatalistic acceptance of their destiny, and often through alcohol or other means of escape. But the scars, both visible and invisible, would have remained. Even the aesthetics of their lives were infused with the omnipresent specter of death. The tea ceremony, with its emphasis on fleeting beauty and transience, wabi-sabi, offered a moment of stillness and contemplation in a chaotic world, a stark contrast to the brutality outside. Zen Buddhism, with its focus on discipline, self-control, and the acceptance of impermanence, resonated deeply with the samurai, offering a spiritual framework for confronting the inevitability of death. These cultural practices were not merely hobbies, they were coping mechanisms, ways to find meaning and inner peace amidst a life that was, by its very nature, violent and short. The meticulous attention to detail in their armor and weapons, the elaborate rituals surrounding seppuku, the precise forms of their martial arts, all of this speaks to an attempt to bring order and meaning to an existence that was inherently chaotic and terrifying. By imposing strict rules and aesthetic principles on the acts of combat and death, the samurai sought to control the uncontrollable, to imbue their violent lives with a sense of purpose and dignity, even when the reality was anything but. The samurai's life was a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, but it was also a chilling reminder of the brutal realities of pre-modern warfare. It was a life where the line between honor and savagery was often blurred, where survival was a daily gamble, and where death, in its myriad gruesome forms, was an ever-present companion. The legends speak of glory, history whispers of unrelenting peril. The political landscape of feudal Japan, particularly during the Sengoku Jidai, was a labyrinthine web of shifting loyalties and brutal pragmatism. A samurai's survival, and indeed the very existence of his clan, hinged on the sagacity and fortune of his lord. Choosing the wrong side in a civil war, even with the best intentions, was a death sentence. Imagine the constant, agonizing calculation. Should one remain loyal to a failing lord, facing certain defeat and likely annihilation, or should one switch allegiance to a rising power, risking the profound dishonor of betrayal, but perhaps ensuring the survival of one's family and retainers? This was not a theoretical dilemma. It was a recurrent, life-or-death decision that haunted every samurai. The consequences of misjudgment were absolute. When a daimyo was defeated, his samurai were often faced with a stark choice: fight to the death, commit seppuku, or become a ronin. The latter, the masterless samurai, often conjures images of heroic wanderers, but the reality was far grimmer. Thousands upon thousands of samurai were rendered ronin after major conflicts like the Battle of Sekigahara or the sieges of Osaka. Stripped of their stipends, their lands confiscated, and their social status obliterated, they often faced destitution. Many resorted to banditry, preying on the very commoners they were once sworn to protect, leading to a swift and ignominious end at the hands of local militias or rival samurai. Others became mercenaries, selling their formidable skills to the highest bidder, their lives still dictated by the blade, but now devoid of the protective structure and idealized honor of clan service. They died in obscure skirmishes, far from the grand battlefields, their names forgotten. Some, more fortunate, found new lords, but this often meant starting at the bottom, proving their loyalty and prowess anew in a world deeply suspicious of those who had once served another. The psychological burden of being a ronin was immense: the loss of purpose, the constant struggle for survival, the gnawing shame of their masterless state. Many succumbed not to a sword, but to despair, disease, or starvation. Marriage alliances, seemingly a path to stability, were another deadly trap. Daimyo frequently cemented alliances by marrying off their daughters or sisters to rival lords, or by taking their daughters as wives. These women, often mere children, became political pawns, their lives subject to the whims of their male relatives. If an alliance soured, these women could be divorced, imprisoned, or even executed, their fate a chilling testament to the fragility of peace. Similarly, the practice of sending family members, particularly sons, as hostages to the shogun's court or to powerful allied lords was a constant source of anxiety. While often treated with respect, these hostages were nevertheless leverage, their lives forfeit should their family betray their allegiance. This system, particularly the Sankinkatai alternate attendance system enforced during the Edo period, which required daimyo to spend every other year in Edo modern Tokyo and leave their families there permanently as hostages, was a deliberate and effective means of control, but also a massive financial burden that could cripple a domain, leading to internal unrest and desperate measures by samurai struggling under the weight of taxes and forced contributions. The very concept of jiri, duty and obligation, versus ninjo, human emotion, was a source of profound, often deadly, internal conflict for a samurai. The rigid code of Bushido demanded unwavering loyalty and the suppression of personal feelings in favor of duty to one's lord and clan. This could mean sacrificing one's family, abandoning a loved one, or even killing a friend, all in the name of jiri. The psychological toll of such choices was immense. The stories of samurai driven to madness or suicide by this internal struggle are not mere literary devices. They reflect a grim reality where emotional suppression was a survival mechanism, but one that often led to profound psychological breakdown. The famous tale of the 47 Ronin, though occurring in a period of relative peace, perfectly encapsulates this deadly conflict. Their unwavering jeering to their disgraced lord led them to years of planning, a brutal act of vengeance, and ultimately a collective seppuku, a testament to the code's enduring, deadly power. Even when the great wars of the Sengoku Jidai finally subsided with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, ushering in 2 centuries of relative peace, the life of a samurai remained fraught with peril. The nature of the danger merely shifted. No longer facing massed armies, they now contended with the rigid, unforgiving social hierarchy of the Bakuhan system, shogunate and domains. The Bushido Code, once a guide for battlefield conduct, became a detailed, often suffocating, set of rules governing every aspect of their lives. The loss of their primary function as warriors created a profound existential crisis for many samurai. They became bureaucrats, administrators, scholars, or even artists, but they were still expected to embody the warrior spirit, to maintain their martial skills, and to be ready to die for their lord at a moment's notice. This disconnect often led to frustration, boredom, and a desperate search for purpose. Duels, though officially discouraged, still occurred with alarming frequency, often over trivial matters of honor or perceived slights. A samurai's pride was easily wounded, and a challenge to a duel could quickly escalate into a fight to the death, even in the absence of a grand war. The right of Kirisuit Gomen, the right to cut down a commoner who had insulted or disrespected a samurai, was a brutal manifestation of this, a stark reminder of the samurai's absolute authority and the commoner's extreme vulnerability. While rarely exercised without consequence, its very existence underscored the constant, deadly power imbalance. Executions remained a common spectacle, not just for criminals, but for samurai who failed in their duties, committed minor infractions, or fell out of favor with their superiors. The threat of forced seppuku persisted, a tool of social control and a means to preserve the honor of a clan by forcing a disgraced individual to take their own life. It was a constant reminder that their lives were not truly their own, but belonged to their lord and the rigid social order. The economic pressures, too, intensified for many samurai during this period of peace. With no wars to fight, their stipends, often paid in rice, became increasingly insufficient as the economy shifted towards a monetary system. Many samurai families fell into debt, forced to sell their family heirlooms or take on additional, often demeaning, work to survive. Poverty, debt, and the inability to maintain appearances could lead to profound shame, sometimes even driving samurai to desperate acts or suicide. The legacy of this deadly existence is etched deep into Japanese culture. The stoicism, the discipline, the emphasis on duty and loyalty, the profound respect for hierarchy, these traits, while perhaps tempered over centuries, have their roots in the brutal realities of the samurai era. The enduring fascination with the samurai, both within Japan and globally, is understandable. They represent an ideal of strength, honor, and martial prowess. But it is crucial to remember that this ideal was forged in a crucible of unimaginable suffering, violence, and death. The romanticized images of cherry blossoms and elegant sword duels are beautiful, perhaps even necessary, fictions that allow us to grapple with a past too horrifying to confront directly. But the truth, unvarnished and unyielding, is that the life of a samurai was a relentless, grinding struggle against a multitude of deadly forces. It was a life where the sword was not just a tool of war, but a constant reminder of one's own mortality. It was a life where honor often meant choosing a painful death over a life of shame, where loyalty could lead one to betray one's own heart, and where peace offered little respite from the ever-present shadow of a sudden, brutal end. They were men, and occasionally women, who lived and died in a world saturated with violence, their existence a testament to the human capacity for both immense cruelty and profound resilience. Their stories, both the glorious and the grim, continue to resonate, reminding us of the fragility of life, the complexities of human nature, and the enduring power of a code forged in the fires of perpetual conflict. The samurai's life was not merely dangerous, it was a relentless, often agonizing dance with death, a dance that few survived intact and none emerged from unchanged. And this then concludes our exploration into why samurai life was far deadlier than you think. The echoes of their struggles, their triumphs, and their tragic ends still reverberate through the annals of history, a chilling testament to a bygone era.